My name is Jack Gilroy, and I'm a member of Peace Action. And I think that you will notice later that Peace Action will be represented by George Haeseler, who will be one of our main speakers. And George will tell you about the possibility of joining Peace Action if you're not already a member. I think if you look at the newsletter that George and Alan Jones put together several times a year, you'll see that you have an opportunity to be a member. But I suspect a lot of you are. What we're really looking for are younger people, obviously. And we're also looking for an excuse as to why we did not yet get the 62 people who called in and said that they were coming. And we're saying maybe it was the morning, where when you wake up in a morning like this morning and say, you know, do I really want to go to a breakfast 3 floors down in a church in Binghamton, rather sack out. Whatever the case may be, we have people here of good faith and spirit, and it's just wonderful every year to meet you, to see some new faces, new people. And so if any of you have not been here before, you should know that we usually start off with a few announcements. One of the announcements is that every Monday afternoon, Ann Clune, as the leading person, is at the Federal Building with groups that range from maybe 8 or 10, sometimes 20 or 30, and we've had gatherings there of over 200. But this has been going on for many years. Ann and Jim and others started at a bridge in Binghamton some 6 years ago, before the war started, and this eventually ended up at the Federal Building. So every Monday, if you have a little bit of spare time, and today is Monday, and people will be there. If it's raining, bring an umbrella. Stand down there as a symbol of justice. We have other activities as well. We should note that there is a group working together to form an impeachment teach-in on October 13th. George will be speaking about this, but I would just remind people that if you are on that team, that you will be meeting here after the walk down to Peace Park. At Peace Park, after all of these events are over, we'll be walking, or you can drive if you want, down to Peace Park, which is at the confluence of the two rivers, the Susquehanna and Shenango rivers. And we'll have there a spokeswoman from the Onondaga Nation, Frida Jacques. And Frida will speak to the need to call that park officially Peace Park. She'll give a little bit of the background of Native Americans. We all see the signs all over this area about the great heroic events of General Sullivan and General Clinton when they came through here in their search and destroy mission. But there's a bit of a different perspective if you happen to be a Native American. The other item I think we should note is that a lot of people have helped bring this event together. The Congregational Church here, First Congregational Church, has consistently been just excellent with us. As you can see, the graciousness, the generosity that they have in extending this invitation to us. Well, it's not necessarily an invitation. We go each year and talk to them and ask them, and the board looks it over and says, well, yeah, we don't think this group is too far off that they can't meet in a church hall. And so we thank them, as we have in the past, for this long history that we have of Hiroshima Day, remembering Hiroshima. Thank all the people who worked on this. They're just, if you were in the kitchen, you'd see it doesn't seem like an awful lot maybe for breakfast, but putting together, cutting the bagels and setting up the grapes and the yogurt and the coffee and the tea and all the rest. And I thank my wife who called this morning. And I thank Helene who called me this morning and she said, are you up? It's 4:30. Time to go and get the bagels and the donuts and the rest of that sort of thing. And I thank Mary Ellen, my daughter, who's been out directing. She's the traffic mall. She's been trying to keep people away from the social services parking, if you didn't happen to know that. And if you're out there now, it's probably too late. But they do not want us in their particular area. And last year, Sunday, not a problem. But today, the workers are in. Mary Ellen and Helene, my wife, my daughter Mary Ellen, my wife Helene, and myself were speechless when we came out of the Hiroshima Museum back about 15 years ago. Mary Ellen at that time was was working in Japan. But we weren't speechless before that on that issue. Many people have spoken out over the years, but no one probably more so than George Haeseler. And I've been working with George probably well over 20 years through peace action. There have been so many excellent people that have come out of the peace action movement. But back in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev were discussing whether or not nuclear weapons should be, the testing of nuclear weapons should be stopped, Mr. Reagan said absolutely not. Mr. Gorbachev stopped for 6 months. Then he went on and extended it for 12 months. Then he went on and extended it for 18 months, no testing. And of course, the United States never did stop until some years later, when we have not been testing, but we're still testing in a computerized manner, and we are still building nuclear weapons. George will speak to that in his topic of a bit of the history of nuclear weaponry, the present, and what we have to look forward into the future. And again, I say, if no one that I know locally is more astute on the issue of nuclear weapons than the former president of Peace Action and the longtime activist, George Haeseler. So please give him a good welcome.
I'm not as gifted a speaker as Jack, so I have to have a few notes and some glasses and a hearing aid. When Jack asked me if I would say a few words about nuclear weapons and the probability of their use, past and future, I told him I was no expert on this topic, and I really am not, but I did what any of you would do, and that is I went to Google and I found a few facts and figures which I think maybe you would be interested in. As you all know, it was 62 years ago today that we did drop the first atomic weapon on Hiroshima. And we killed 140,000 people outright. That was a 13 kiloton nuclear bomb. That doesn't refer to the weight of the bomb. That 13 kiloton means that it was the equivalent of the explosive power of 13,000 tons of TNT. Now that was a small bomb compared to what was to be developed in the future when we developed megaton bombs. That is, bombs that were measured in millions of tons. And in fact, the largest nuclear weapon that we've ever tested here was a 15 megaton bomb. That was the equivalent of 1,000 Hiroshimas, that one bomb. Doing the math, that's the same as 30 billion pounds of dynamite, which is enough for 5 pounds of dynamite for every soul on this planet. 3 years later, 3 days later, we dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. That was a 21 kiloton bomb, and that kills 70,000 people for a total of 210,000 people. But it didn't end there, because many died afterwards as complications. Another 160,000 for a total of 370,000 people killed with those two bombs. That's almost as many Americans as were killed in all of World War II. And after speaking with the mayor this morning, he told me there were 48,000 people in the city of Binghamton. So that was about 8 times the population of Binghamton that died from those two bombs. And it wasn't our only option. To quote Eisenhower, he said, "The Japanese were ready to surrender, and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing," end quote. Well, that was not our only option, and but nevertheless, we did do it, and I was only 17 years old at the time. If you're doing the math, that makes me 79 today. And I was glad, like everybody else, that we had dropped the bomb, because it ended the war. In fact, I thought it would end all wars. I thought it would make wars obsolete. Certainly, no country would ever again dare attack us like they had at Pearl Harbor, because we had the ultimate weapon to respond with. I didn't imagine then, however, that instead of being attacked, we would become the attacker. In the next 62 years, we would bomb 24 countries. We would invade 15, and we would be directly and indirectly responsible for the death of over 6 million people. Well, our purpose getting together today is not to go on a guilt trip about this, but to pledge ourselves to do whatever we can to make sure this never happens again. Our monopoly of nuclear weapons ended 4 years later in 1949 when the Soviet Union exploded their first bomb. And a year after that, they developed the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the means to deliver that bomb to our shores. And a year after that, we did the same, to deliver one to their shores. And that was the beginning of the arms race between our two countries, and that lasted for 40 years. And people took us seriously. They built home fallout shelters. I was living in Appalachian at the time, and I knew some neighbors who had done that. I did not do it because I knew I'd have to come out of that shelter sometime or other, and I didn't want to face the world that I knew that I would see. So the nuclear arms race made the likelihood of nuclear weapons use more likely, because the more weapons there were, the more likely they could be used, either intentionally or accidentally. And at the height of the nuclear arms race, there were 70,000 warheads worldwide. There were 27 nuclear accidents and 52 nuclear incidents. The difference between an accident and an incident is that an accident has the potential to launch a nuclear weapon, whereas an incident is an error, a human error or a mechanical error associated with the program. But the arms race also made the possibility of nuclear war less probable because there was a stalemate. We could not launch a weapon against the Soviet Union or vice versa without expecting one in return. It was called MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. And then there was Carl Sagan, who you recall, talked about a nuclear winter. He said that if there were enough nuclear weapons that went off, and we had enough, that could cause a nuclear winter or the end of civilization on this planet as we knew it. So with those kind of threats, that helped stabilize the situation. In 1962, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. How many were around for that? Raise your hands. Yes. I don't know if you remember it, but that was serious stuff. And I thought, well, this is it. It scared me half to death. It scared me, an atheist, to church. Not to pray, of course, but to listen to the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he told us that the Soviet Union had put missiles in Cuba in response to the ones that we had put on the Soviet border in Turkey. And Castro was very agreeable to this because a year earlier had been the Bay of Pigs. And he felt, rightfully so, I think, that the presence of nuclear missiles on his soil might be a deterrent to another attempt at an invasion. I will be forever grateful, not to Kennedy, and he did show restraint, that's for sure, but to Khrushchev, because Kennedy, rather than reacting to some of his hawks and bombing Cuba, decided to have a naval blockade to prevent any more missiles from arriving on ships from the Soviets. But it was Khrushchev who turned the ships around. So it was he that blinked, and I'm certainly glad that he did blink. In 1968, there was the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and 188 nations signed that treaty and agreed that they would not acquire nuclear weapons, provided that those 5 that had them would negotiate in good faith to disarm. Well, the 188 nations that signed, they kept their word, but the 5 nations that said they would disarm did not. In fact, they did just the opposite, and the biggest culprits were the United States and the Soviet Union. In the 70s, we had détente, and that was good. We were talking with the Soviet Union, and we even signed some treaties limiting the size of our arsenals. In 1980, we had the nuclear freeze movement. How many here participated in the nuclear freeze movement? Raise your hands. Right. Well, if you did, and you did it locally here, which I guess you might have, you'll know that we collected 10,000 signatures. Am I talking too loud? Okay. I can't hear well, so I talk loud. I think everybody does that, don't they? Oh, yes. Well, anyway, locally here in Binghamton, we did collect 10,000 signatures. An organization that was in charge of that was Project Please, and that was the predecessor to our present organization of Broome County Peace Action. In 1989, there was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And that was the end of the Cold War. And I think many of us breathed a sigh of relief. And we thought that would make the possibility of a nuclear exchange less likely. But in a way, it increased the probability of a nuclear exchange, because with the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a loss of centralized control of the nuclear weapons, and they were dispersed throughout. And some ended up unaccountable, and some are unaccounted for today. So where are we today? What is the likelihood of there being a nuclear explosion today? Well, I think it is actually more likely than it ever has been before. In fact, it may be inevitable. Today, there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, and there are more that want them, and understandably so, if for no other reason than as a deterrent to the United States aggression, or to give themselves what they consider to be prestige, and so they'll be listened to at the bargaining table. There still are 30,000 nuclear warheads in the world today. And of those, 6,000 are relatively small. They're called tactical, and if they're really small, suitcase bombs. They're 1 to 5 kilotons. And they're particularly dangerous because they're easier to get hold of, they'd be easier to transport and explode. And we still have the possibility of accidents or miscalculations. And how do we know that the leaders of these nuclear states will always be rational, that they'll always have good judgment? The fact that Bush has now deployed our fleet off the shores of Iran with nuclear weapons certainly on board of some of them, I don't think is good judgment. Even one of the presidential candidates, popular among peaceniks maybe, Barack Obama, has just came out and said that when he was asked, he said he felt that we should violate the sovereignty of Pakistan, and without their permission, go ahead and track down Al-Qaeda on their soil if Pakistan doesn't do a good enough job. Well, we have to remember that Pakistan is a nuclear state. It's governed by a dictator, Musharraf. And how would he react if we were to do such a thing? Certainly not to combat us with conventional weapons. If he didn't use his nuclear weapons himself, I'm sure he could put them in the hands of terrorists who would be more than willing to do so. Speaking of which, that is our greatest threat. The idea that a terrorist or a terrorist group might get their hands on a suitcase or a tactical weapon. They could steal one, they could buy one, they could fabricate one from stolen uranium, and it wouldn't be that hard for them to smuggle it past our shores, or past our borders. And it would be easy to deliver. It could be delivered by car, van, truck, or a light plane. I was in Washington, D.C. several years ago with my family, and while they were up on top of the Washington Monument, I was driving around in my van trying to find a parking place. I drove around for 2 hours and never found one. It was bumper-to-bumper parking. And the thought occurred to me at that time that any one of those cars could have in its trunk a small nuclear device timed to explode. Or then maybe someday a van like mine could be driving around Washington, D.C. with a suicidal driver who could then park it wherever he wished and explode the bomb. And what about the truck that Timothy McVeigh used to blow up the Oklahoma City building? That contained conventional weapons, but a truck like that could just as well have had a nuclear weapon in it. And just recently, a light plane crashed into a building in Manhattan on the East River. Well, if that plane can do that, any light plane can do it. And if it contained a nuclear weapon, it wouldn't have to pick a particular building. Any place in Manhattan would do just fine. And there are no shortage of candidates who would be willing to commit such an act. We certainly made enough enemies, and maybe the relatives or the friends of some of those 6 million people that were responsible for killing would like to get back even with us. No citizen wants to see his country bombed, invaded, or occupied. We certainly would not. We've been told that if we don't fight the terrorists over there, we're going to have to fight them here. Another Bush lie. what we're really doing is we're creating terrorists over there, people who hate us, who would be very willing to come over here and even sacrifice themselves if necessary to get even. And if a terrorist did explode a nuclear weapon on our soil, how would Bush react to that? Or how would any president react to that? We know how Bush reacted to 9/11. 1 month later, he gave orders to bomb Afghanistan, and he killed as many people then, innocent people, as were killed in the World Trade Center. So what's the solution? Well, I don't know if there is a solution, but there are some things that would help. One would be to change our foreign policy so we would stop making so many enemies, so we would stop trying to dominate the world. I think the true message of 9/11 was lost on the American public. I remember Bush telling us that those 19 hijackers were jealous of our democracy. How many here remember that expression, jealous of our democracy? Raise your hands. Well, that doesn't make much sense, doesn't it? Does it? What they really did is they hated our country, hated it enough to take their own lives. I think that the fact that they targeted, the buildings that they targeted, gives away what their rationale was. They hated our military, political, and economic interventions. That's why they targeted those particular buildings. So a change in our foreign policy would help, stop making so many enemies. Certainly we could, for the first time, pass legislation which would stop our president from launching a first strike. Our country has never agreed that it would not launch a first strike nuclear attack on another, even a non-nuclear state. That would certainly help. And then I think if we could start to curb the powers of our president, what Bush has done in moving us towards a dictatorship is going to continue to last. I mean, that's not going to go away. Once a precedent will have been established unless it's challenged. And that's why it's so important that impeachment proceedings begin. Impeachment does not have to be successful. I'm really glad to get that kind of a reaction from you, because the next thing I'm going to ask you to do is support the teaching on impeachment that we're having on October 13th here at the Forum Theater. And as you know, the Forum Theater is a large theater. It's as big as the Anderson Center, 1,400 seats, and we really want to fill it up. So we'll need a lot of people trying to get other people to go and attend it. Another way you can support it is to have your name listed in the program as a supporter of the event. And then you can do that by making out the form that's included in the newsletter that's on your table. There really is only one sure way to make sure that we are never attacked with a nuclear weapon, or anyone is, and that is to get rid of them all. There is no reason that I can possibly think of why the U.S. should have 10,000 nuclear weapons and Iraq can't have one. Now, what's the rationale behind that? You know, much was made of the fact that we justified the war against Iraq because we thought that they had weapons of mass destruction. What if they did have weapons of mass destruction? They were certainly entitled to it, and certainly more entitled to it than we were to have 10,000. And why is Israel allowed to have 200 or 300 and Iran can't have any? And the strange thing is, if we got rid of all the nuclear weapons in the world, the country that would benefit the most is the United States. And the reason is that's our only area of vulnerability right now. We have enough conventional forces, certainly, to ward off anything that might ever attack us. So it is we that would really benefit the most. And I don't understand why you never hear a politician make that statement. Well, we have a politician here today. And we have the kind of politician we want. And we have one that understands these issues, and one who is willing to, as he has done in the past, stick his neck out on what is thought to be an unpopular issue. And it won't be the first unpopular issue that Matt Ryan hasn't been willing to come forward with. And I'm really glad that he has been willing to be here today and to sign the statement calling for an end of nuclear weapons. And it's my real pleasure to introduce Matt.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me this morning. First of all, thanks to the Broome County Peace Action Network that is so responsible for so many of the things that are going on and our community about the awareness of the Iraq War, and thanks to your vigilance each Monday out in front of the federal courthouse to fight what is clearly an immoral, unjust, and illegal war in Iraq. So thank you for all the efforts you make there. You know, in our history, we spent $4 trillion. I know George gave most of the facts, but there's a few other facts. $4 trillion on nuclear weapons. 25 to $30 billion is budgeted in this budget alone for fiscal year 2008. And a total budget for our military this year, for 2008, is $768 billion for defense, homeland security, war, and war-related costs. I think it's clear, estimates now are that the war in Iraq will cost us $2.7 trillion when everything is said and done. And you know, I go back to that figure from the first Iraq War, which only lasted a few days, and the cost to, obviously not, this is just to our country and the people who fought it for our country, is $6 to $8 billion a year in medical costs for those soldiers who came back. That's a 4-day war. Just think what this one's going to cost, not just in dollars, but in, listen to Democracy Now! The other day, Amy Goodman had a report on about some soldiers who have committed suicide and it's coming home, and the horrible tragedies it's causing all over our country for returning soldiers, not just for their physical bodies, but also obviously their mental well-being. So, you know, while this is about nuclear weapons, I think all of us probably in this room agree that we have to find another way to deal with each other on the planet, because it's not just it's a sustainability of our planet. That's what's really at stake. If we continue on the path we're going, we're not going to survive, I don't think. And clearly this is, but nuclear weapons are the biggest threat. And the proliferation of nuclear weapons is obviously a concern. For a while, the nuclear clock that they watched was standing still. Now it's been, I think it's been readjusted for that people understand that the risk is greater. And so our vigilance and all the people that are fighting to end the threat of nuclear weapons is so much more important. So I have a statement that the following statement was released by mayors and members of parliaments and congresses meeting in conjunction with the 7th Review Conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in May 2005, and has been endorsed by the mayors and national leaders over, I think it's 1,600, right, across the world. And I plan to sign on to that today. As mayors and legislators, the statement is, as mayors and legislators, we have a role to protect the security of citizens living within our jurisdiction and to protect our localities for future generations. Such security is not advanced when there remain 30,000 nuclear weapons, many of which are deployed and ready for use at short notice. The risk of nuclear weapons use by accident, design, or miscalculation is increasing due to the proliferation of nuclear weapons to new states, the possibility of non-state access to nuclear weapons and bomb-building materials, and the expanding nuclear weapons use doctrines of the nuclear weapons states. Regardless of where nuclear weapons are targeted or detonated, or whether they are used by terrorist organizations or state militaries, no one would escape the calamitous consequences of nuclear attack. Even cities that are not the direct brunt of an attack would feel the global, economic, social, and medical repercussions which would dwarf those of 9/11. Any nuclear weapons use would cause unimaginable devastation, requiring massive aid, global efforts from all nuclear fallout, global effects from all nuclear fallout, and a rise in refugees seeking to escape the most contaminated regions. The only way to prevent nuclear weapons use is to eliminate all nuclear weapons as mandated by Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the 1996 International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. Mayors for Peace have provided a vision for the achievement of a nuclear weapons-free world by 2020. Therefore, we, the undersigned mayors and parliamentarians, call for the commencement of negotiations which would culminate in the comprehensive abolition and elimination of nuclear weapons and the international control of nuclear materials to prevent clandestine bomb making. If a small number of states continue to prevent such negotiations being initiated at the Conference on Disarmament and also at the Non-Proliferation Treatment Review Conferences, then governments should be encouraged to find an alternative track to nuclear disarmament, as was done with the Landmines Convention. The overwhelming majority of citizens in our cities, countries, and around the world support the abolition of these ultimate weapons of mass destruction, and we mayors and legislators have a responsibility to use our authority to ensure the implementation of this imperative. You know, George said something about, am I too loud? I don't think we can be too loud.
So do we have the photographer take an official sign here?
Thank you.
There really are so many things that can be done. One of the things we have to talk about is to bring together the various peace groups that have developed during this past 5 years, 4.5, 5 years. It really is 5 years because the real movement began in the fall 5 years ago. Tom Hayden was asked by a friend of mine recently, meeting him in New York, if he thought the peace movement was dead. And here's Tom, of course, who went to jail many times during the 60s. Tom said, actually, there's more life to it than during the 60s. And I was kind of taken aback by that. But what he was talking about was the internet, was the development of peace organizations developing throughout the whole country. Something is going on. And we have the power now to bring all this together. And guys like Adam Flint, professor from Hartwick College, who is coming back to town to talk to you about a proposal he has, I think is a person who should be listened to. Thank you, Adam.
Though the latest surge in this movement may have begun 5 years ago, looking around this room, I see people who I've known since I was very, very small. I came here to talk about a proposal that I've been working on in consultation with many folks in this community, and there'll be many more that we'll be talking with, that seeks to move things here to the next level. I still remember when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, and I showed up the next day at the high school wearing black, and people thought I had completely lost my mind. Some of them reconsidered years later. All of you knew why that was a very serious moment. Little did we know how serious a moment it was, because that, of course, ushered in all of the changes for the worse that we've seen. But this community has always had a small but vital peace and social justice group, various groups of people, many of whom are represented here today. But one thing that we've never had here that many communities across the country have, and more are building now, is a center to help strengthen and build upon the base that we already have. And that's the concept of this center. I wanted to say one word on a personal note. If you had asked me back in 1980 or 1982, Adam, are you going to remain here, raise a family here? I would have said, have you lost your mind? What am I going to do here? This community doesn't seem to speak to my condition. But a lot of things changed over the last few years that Jack was talking about. We had the founding of the first independent media center here in Binghamton. We had the incredible energy that was brought to an injustice, the trying of the St. Patrick's Four with a citizens tribunal. We had the Southern Tier Progressive Coalition, And of course, we had the election of Matt Ryan. And that gave me and my partner, Mick Tulamello, hope that this was actually a place that was not only for us, but that we could really contribute to in a big way. And so while I talk very briefly about some of the things you'll see before you in that flyer, and that's simply a summary, your yellow flyer there, of where things stand now in terms of the thinking of this center. I'm not just talking here, and we're not just talking here about important political change at the local level, which is obviously very important. I think we're talking about changing the culture of this area. How many people who were 16 years old like I was would have known to respond to the election of Ronald Reagan were it not for people like you, right? So we need to build on that. The idea here is not to create something that reinvents the wheel. There's 4 elements of the center as it stands. One is to build existing organizational capacity. There are many groups in this room. I'm a member, of course, of the Binghamton El Charcon Sister City Project. We all know how few people do so much work. And one of the things that this center would seek to do is to strengthen the ability of all of the volunteers that are currently in groups to do more, to have more capacity, more organizing ability, but also to bring in new and especially younger people. And that's one thread that runs through this entire idea, is to focus on building these groups, retaining volunteers, but especially younger volunteers. Second thing that we would look to do here is really build on the work the Independent Media Center has done to have an alternative voice that can at once be autonomous from the mainstream corporate media. I should say corporate, it's not mainstream at all. And also serve as a place where groups like this can have a venue and a forum. Because actually of the great successes that have occurred, Tarek was a key member, and he is a key member in the IMC, but he has other things to do with his time these days. Stefan Schweitzer, who is another very important member and continues to work with the IMC, became a VISTA volunteer. And for those of you who study social movements, this is part of the catch-22. When people from the movement move into government, new people need to take the reins of community organizations, and they need to have the capacity to do that. But they also need to have the capacity to be able to reach beyond the choir, the converted. And I think by building on that success of the Independent Media Center and what continues to be a flagship, The Bridge, which there are a few copies of the quarterly newspaper if you haven't already seen it, back where Kevin Bunger is sitting near the front of the room. It's really a wonderful thing. It's an international movement, and it's something that more people in this community should be involved in. So expanding communication among organizations and outreach to the larger community is the second area. The third is facilitating peace and social justice public education. You notice I said facilitating because I know there are a lot of people in this room that have been doing peace and social justice education, either where they teach. Jack did that for many years when he was at Maine Endwell, and there are many others of you here with Teachers for Peace and who are doing other things. But building on that and spreading that further. All of you know who are involved in specific organizations, you have your work cut out for you fulfilling the mission of your organization, whether it's Peace Action or School of the Americas Watch or what have you. What I would do, I hope, is to do those things which people don't have time for who are volunteering for these things. And so one of the key elements, the fourth key element here, is coalition and community building and civic engagement. Many of you were aware of what was going on with the Southern Tier Progressive Coalition, and one of those things was to increase coordination and communication so that different groups were aware of each other's efforts, could support those efforts, but also to start having those conversations now about what kinds of things we can do not only to respond to crises, but be proactive. When the Iraq War came down the pike, obviously many of us know each other, but wouldn't it have been nice if not only every single group in this room had a plan on how we would respond, but there were many, many other organizations involved and many other people. And that's really, I think, one of the key elements is to use this center to reach out and bring in not only individuals, but also connect us more, the peace and social justice groups, with groups that are doing bread and butter work right in this community that's absolutely critical, right? And not have, people who are essentially of like mind, but are so busy doing their different things, doing them in different directions. Now, just to conclude, what I'm hoping to get from you is the answer to the question, what can this center do for me, for my organization, for my community? Obviously, there are some answers on this page. This center is, the idea is to get off the ground by June of 2008, which may seem like a fair amount of time, but the minimum necessary for this to be sustainable, and I say minimum, is $60,000 a year. So given that figure and what many of us are used to in this community, that sounds like a lot of money. But when I talk to people who are in other parts of this community who raise funds for other things, they're saying, oh, no big deal. Well, we'll see. But one of the things, obviously, that's important is not only your support, but the support of others that you know, and ideas about getting support, and ideas about reaching out to people in our community who may be far more receptive to our message today, now that many, many verities, many truths that we thought were so, or others thought were so, about what big companies would do for us in hard times, that's all been exploded, right, with what's been going on in Endicott for some years and in other places. And finally, this organization, which does not yet exist as an organization, will need a board and an advisory board. The difference between the two is simple. Members of the board do work, and especially members of the executive committee will do a fair amount of work. The advisory board are people who are leaders, important individuals and organizations sitting in this room and elsewhere who lend their name and support, but are not expected to put in quite as much work to make this a reality. This is obviously not a one-man effort. It's an effort that needs to be made by a community. As I think Jack mentioned, although I don't know if he made it explicit, I am coming back literally from Hartwick at the end of this academic year. I'm leaving Hartwick. One of the reasons for that is Mick and I want to have a second child. And after 8 years of schlepping back and forth on Route 88, I've decided that's enough. So I can do one of two things. I can do this, or I can do something else. And so depending on how important this is, what difference you all think and others think this can make, I'd be more than happy to take the first choice. Thank you all for your time, and thank Jack's patience for taking 2 minutes more.
Personally, I think it's a great idea, Adam. Syracuse has had a peace center for many, many years, and very successful center. And south of us, Wilkes-Barre, actually it's in Wyoming, I believe, also has a very good peace center. So Binghamton would fit right in with that particular group.